Hello, everyone. For those of you who I have not met yet, my name is Lisa Wocken. I am what you might consider a DAO educator and researcher. And the primary work that I do is as a core team member at Talent DAO. Talent DAO's mission in the DAO ecosystem is to really unlock talent and decentralize research. And the way that we go about that is really leveraging data science. We have a lot of industrial organizational psychologists on our team, and we do deep data science research on how to accelerate and advance DAOs in the DAO ecosystem. So some examples of the type of work that you may have seen or will see coming out from us is a study on compensation where we surveyed 166 individuals, primarily from Bankless DAO, looking at the sentiments toward different ways of compensating members of DAOs. Another study that we're just kicking off is with Aragon, looking at them as a case study and writing up that case on progressive decentralization. So how to start more centralized and then progressively work toward the ideal of a decentralized organization. So these are just some of the things, but my particular role is as the primary researcher on this body of work that we are just kicking off, focused on decentralized leadership and what leadership looks like in the decentralized world of work, which is our topic today. The other things to maybe know about me as we dive into this space is I have my entire background is studying, researching, and practicing enterprise-wide leadership development, primarily in large corporations, but left a couple of years ago to found my own, what would be considered like a Web2 e-commerce startup called Bolster Leadership that focuses on peer-to-peer leadership and how we can bolster the leadership capabilities of one another. And that's really what led me to the DAO space to begin with. So this is my jam. I absolutely love this stuff, and I'm really excited to speak with all of you today of what is the initial thinking and where is this body of research headed? But more importantly, what does it mean in this context for you all as superhumans? I know this is your internal learning session, and we're gonna, in true fine fashion, share a little bit to stoke the conversation, but then to get it to a more localized level of what's resonating and what works best for you all in your context. All right, with that being said, let's jump into it. Thanks for letting me introduce myself. And what I'd like you to do now is to, wherever you are, whatever you're up to turn your attention to the present moment. We can all get distracted and have a lot of things going on, but I genuinely believe if this is something you turn your attention toward, it'll have you thinking differently by the end of it. And so we'll start with just a reflection on your own experiences. And if you want to hit to the next slide, we'll just ask you to reflect on your best leader, or if you don't necessarily want to label someone as a leader, the best show of leadership that you experienced pre-DAOs. And I want you to get very visual. If it's a person, picture their exact face, what they were doing, what they were saying, what you remember from that moment, how it made you feel. If it's a show of leadership, maybe there were multiple people involved, but whatever it is, get very crystallized. And this might be a good time to flip over to the text hub if you have that available to you, to just share some of the things that are popping up, some of the things that are coming to mind. What words might summarize this person, this event? Character. Wonderful. Well, as you continue to type or continue to reflect, we can move on to the next question, which is really reflect on now your best leader or show of leadership that you've experienced in DAOs. So, what have you seen that's worked really well from a show of leadership in DAOs? And similarly, I'd like you to get really specific and share any thoughts you might have, different or otherwise, in the chat. Initiative, engaged. Yeah, and already I see compassionate. Okay. And yeah, already I see, maybe it wouldn't be considered too wild to think that what's working well in DAOs also might have been a good sign of leadership before, but we are coming up with different words. And I think that's really important. And that's really at the crux of all this. So that brings us then to the next question, which is, does leadership matter? And maybe there's a way to give reactions or to share if you believe that that leadership matters. Feel free to even come off mute and say yes, no. I'd love to hear some comments.
You want to hear if leadership matters?
Well, so after going through that exercise, just a quick yes, no, taking a pulse.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you, Poopster.
No problem.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. Okay, good. It's helpful just to get the feedback going. Yeah, I think unequivocally people would say that leadership absolutely does matter. And yet in the DAO space, there is some hesitation around conversations of leadership because we intermingle it with this concept of authority. And so that's part of what we're going to unpack is, what does this mean? What does leadership look like? And before we can really unpack it, we're going to step back a little bit and look at more of a macro context and evolution in this space. So if we go to the next slide, you'll see that there's been a progression that we're all aware of. But I want you to consider this when it comes to how leadership might need to evolve. If you have Web 1, where you're viewing products, Web 2, where you're interacting with products more, but now this shift back to this idea that you really are about to enter into an era of deep ownership of your own products, that does require different education, different leadership, different structures. And it really is a different mindset and approach that we have to how we work and engage with the world. So if we then go on to what really caused all this, the next slide really boils it down to why DAOs even exist. DAOs, quite frankly, could not have existed before blockchain technology. And it's blockchain technology that gives us this way to trust and reliably exchange with other people without the need of the middleman. And yet, so many of our traditional organizations have what we call people leaders that almost act like the middleman. They're the ones who have power over promotions, power over budget, power over whether we see ourselves having a runway or the ability to advance in an organization or not. There's that lovely adage that people don't leave jobs, they leave managers. And that's still considered very true, study after study, that one of the top reasons people leave their job is because of their direct manager. And so it really does influence how we see stuff. So when you think about a DAO where you take out that middleman that has that power over, we need to understand, how does that impact leadership? Because just like somebody can leave a job because of a leader, they can also be retained and be engaged and be excited about their work because of a leader. What we're really trying to do is decouple the authority and the power over, while still maintaining a sense of encouragement, partnership, and help and support that we can get from our peers and can get from one another in different DAO structures. And so that's what brings us to this next idea of what exactly is a DAO, how are we working in DAOs? And if we look at the next slide, what you'll see is really when Vitalik first talked about DAOs, this idea that they are organizations that are run by code with people at the periphery. And traditional organizations are really run by people where code's contributing. But one of the unique things is that we have blockchain, and that really distinguishes DAOs from other organizations. And yet, the idea of shared community and shared purpose is actually the thing that has not changed throughout all of human history on what institutes humans coordinating and functioning together. Human coordination has been, always will be, about humans coming together with this shared purpose and shared community. The unique part then is when we get capital involved and differentiate our processes by what blockchain enables. Which then brings us to the next slide, which focuses really on the work shift. And again, this is everything that we know to be true about DAOs, but consider the leadership implications and the mindset shift that needs to occur in order for people to not just copy paste Web 2 thinking onto the current environment, but to really allow Web 3 to take on its more idealistic and decentralized form. And so you'll see that the work of DAOs, it does look different in structure, in rules, decision, capital, roles, access, incentives, records, and location. There are not many areas where we should just be copy pasting confidently from traditional orgs to DAOs. In fact, right now is absolutely the height of the time that we need to be suspending judgments and trying to find out what works best for these new entities that we're creating without ignoring history, without ignoring research, but really suspending those judgments and asking way more questions and coming at it from a place of curiosity and experimentation versus knowing and expertise. And so this really then gets on to what exactly do we mean then when we say, all right, DAOs are more decentralized, and there's this notion of leadership in the decentralized world of work. What exactly do we even mean by that? And if you go to the next slide, you'll see that Vitalik has this article that's been pretty well circulated about why the word decentralization is so confusing. And that's because there's really three different types of decentralization that we often are talking about. And the first one is architectural. And if you hit next, you'll see that what this really means is that no one point of architecture depends on another. So it's a resilient infrastructure. If the internet goes out in New York, it doesn't mean that I in Minnesota don't have access to internet. You know, it's a very resilient infrastructure. The second one is logical. And this is really that there's no one place of centralized information that other parts depend on. It's more of a swarm system where communication and information can flow more organically and people can source what they need when they need it. There's not as many information gatekeepers. And I know that's one thing I've heard from a lot of people in DAOs is really liberating is this idea of the transparency and the access to information and the ability to have ambitions and take initiative without there being as many stopgaps. And that's a product of this more swarm system. And then the last one is really where leadership gets into it. And this is about political decentralization, which is really, again, that decoupling of authority from leadership, which is that no one group gets to set the rules for another, that people really set their own rules. And I think this is so important. And it does require leadership by the way of clarity of how do we set our rules? How do we engage with one another? How do we hold one another accountable without having power over? And so I think that's where we start getting into this really interesting space of what role does leadership really play? And so on the next slide, what we get into is almost in a way trying to define leadership and get at what do we mean when we talk about leadership in DAOs. Leadership over time has evolved from this great man theory of there's one person who's going to save us all to then being focused more on traits. Maybe you're born as a leader. What are those traits? And then realizing, hey, maybe we can cultivate some of these leadership traits. And maybe leadership can actually be something that we develop. It's really a set of skills or capabilities. And then it evolved to this idea of equal authority. We've already touched on this. Leaders always emerge, and that we'll touch on the next slide. And then leadership in DAOs looks different. It does look different. It might seem nuanced or might seem like we're just trying to repackage something to be different, but it actually is different because of how the organizations are blockchain enabled and this strong cultural and value bent toward transparency and decentralization. And so if we go to the next one, what you'll see is that DAOs are not, though, the first and only to ever look at this idea of how do we not have a ton of hierarchy. We actually know from studying 14,000 different organizations, there was an academic who did a meta-analysis looking at 14,000 different teams, not organizations, teams, and basically found that as you introduce hierarchy, you do introduce more human conflict. And yet structurelessness is not the goal either. And so you'll see there's this writer, Jo Freeman, who she basically wrote about this idea of structurelessness to say to strive for a structureless group is as useful and as deceptive as to aim at an objective news story or value-free social science or a free economy. Basically, when humans gather, leaders emerge and structures emerge. But you actually want the structures to be transparent. And if you try to aim for structurelessness, what happens is structures still get constructed, but they are based on some things that you may not want, which if you hit next, you'll see that what we also know is that all groups create informal structures as a result of interaction patterns among the members of the group. So such informal structures can do very useful things, but only unstructured groups are totally governed by them. So we almost need structure in order to be the check and balance that our informal interaction patterns don't run away with the organization. Because what they found, and Jo Freeman really wrote about the feminist movement, there's lots of research on women rights or Black Lives Matter or some of these, leaderless groups, supposedly leaderless. But what we know is that they all benefit from having greater structures put into place. And without those, a lot of things can actually usurp the effectiveness of the groups. So what was written here in the tyranny of structurelessness was that there are essentially two outcomes when you try to aim for not having structure. And those two outcomes, if you hit next, we'll see are really about this idea that people listen to others because they like them, not necessarily because they say significant things. And I think in a lot of DAOs, we see that play out. It's people who show up regularly, or it's people who are the loudest, or it's people who are the most liked, but not necessarily the ones that we want to be integrating their perspectives. We might only be getting a subset of them. And then the other outcome that often happens in groups that are trying to be structureless is that the informal structures have no obligation to be responsible for the group at large, that their power was not given to them, so it cannot be taken away. Their influence is not based on what they do for the group. So they cannot really be directly influenced by the group. And having structures of influence is actually really helpful to humans coordinating. So that brings us to some of our last couple points here before we open this up, which is really leadership. When we talk about DAOs, we're really talking about influence in an evolving context. But in a more formal flex of leadership, we're really talking about working on the container. If you're a leader in a DAO, odds are you're focused on trying to further that decentralization in all those different spheres, in the architectural, in the logical, and in the political, of trying to work on the container, one where no one person or no one group has disproportionate power or who has true authority over another to strip others of autonomy. And so that work on the container is actually really important and worthy work. And there's often not people who are only doing that. They are also simultaneously being members. And that's really working on the contents of the DAO. So you might hear people say working in a DAO and working on the DAO. We do need people to be playing these different roles. And leader might sound like it's glorifying work on the container. What I really mean by that, though, is helping ensure that a structure and a system is in place for people to thrive and do their best work. And so then what happens is we've had a couple rules pop up in this space. So on the next slide, what we have is really this addition of what so far has emerged. But this is really where our body of research is going in the next years to understand what do people view as leadership in DAOs? Is it these roles? I would argue that it's more about influence in the evolving context, that it's more of a process and a focus that individuals take on when it's needed by the community versus it being roles and titles. And yet, as I've talked to people, these are the people that people point to often. They're either the leader of a guild. The time that people are using leader is when they talk about founder, when they talk about community managers. There's onboarding and connectors, people who may in more of a Web 2 context have a certain amount of value. That value has been heightened because DAOs right now have a collective pain point around how do we onboard and scale up and connect people to contributing, because it's not a situation where somebody was hired, applied for a job. It's one where they are opting in and need that support and that guidance. And that's also why facilitators and educators tend to emerge as these rules that really help work on the container, help connect people across different guilds and across different DAOs. And so the last couple pieces that I'd share are on this idea of what exactly then do we want to be talking about when it comes to leadership in DAOs? If it's not these titles, what does that really look like? And on the next slide, you'll see that really there's this overarching banner, and it's about Mojo over ego. And even one of the words on what's the best leadership look like in Web3 that was in the chat was initiative. And it really does take initiative and ambition and a sense of self and assertiveness to be able to come with Mojo in order to contribute in such a fluid space at times, like the DAO ecosystem. And so if you hit next, what you'll see is how we talk about Mojo. For those of you who don't know, there's actually in the Merriam-Webster dictionary, the definition of Mojo is magic power, very broadly spoken. And I think that's so befitting. We're all on Discord. It's got a lot of gamer roots sometimes in the DAO ecosystem, but it really is about knowing yourself, knowing your strengths, what you potentially might be able to contribute, and then confidently sharing your asks and offers. And I think that actually goes quite a long way in a demonstration of leadership within DAOs if you can do just that. And then ego has its own sort of definition. And if you hit next, you'll see that it's about your sense of self. Your ego is actually what monitors or moderates your version of yourself versus reality. But practically speaking, it can get in the way of a lot of the community first ethos of DAOs and this mission of decentralization, because the ego is always looking for kind of that what's in it for me. And I think a lot of times that can actually trip up this focus on how do we decentralize, diffuse, and almost take the energy away from any one individual. That can feel like a threatening situation to egos, and that's okay. And maybe you can already think of situations in your own DAO experience where you noticed somebody's ego was feeling threatened. That's a very natural human part of any working, functioning group, and the individuals in it. And it's also something we need to be able to, in a way, speak to, is redefining success is not what's in it for me, but more about the impact and what we can advance. And I know that's the banner of a lot of DAOs, and we also still need to be able to address the threatened state of egos in moments. And sometimes the banner of Mojo doesn't always address that adequately. So sometimes we need to speak to the ego of letting people know how there can be abundance and how both the individual and the collective can advance in this new world of decentralized work. All right, and so one of the things that Talent DAO specializes in, as I mentioned, is data science. And we have this amazing data scientist who his whole thing is looking and culling through droves of meta-analyses and systematic literature reviews to try to find high quality pieces of research. And I've partnered with him recently, and we have a Mir article that we'll be publishing in the next week on shared leadership and looking at what we already know is something that DAOs want, which is more of a shared model of leadership, and what exactly is required in order for that to emerge. So if we look at the next slide, you'll see what was found through a number of meta-analyses and systematic reviews. This looks like a fancy graph. So what we'll do is we'll just break it down very quickly into the key takeaways. And that's really on this next slide. And the next one really talks a lot about this idea of what is important about shared leadership. And the ingredients of it are really that you have a shared purpose, but what that means to people is really knowing where to go and how to get there. The other thing that's needed is social support, so people willing to lend a hand to each other. And then the last piece is really that individuals in the community can influence team direction and actions, meaning that they have the ability to voice. So you see, those are the antecedents into shared leadership. If we don't get those things right as a DAO, the concept of shared leadership really is a pipe dream. And fortunately, a lot of that's baked into basic governance processes and architectures of DAOs. But it's important that we don't lose sight of that as DAOs get more complex, more mature, and scale up. And then the other piece that's really important, if you go to the next slide, you can even just hit next, 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 next across the 5 bullets. And what you'll see is that shared leadership is a worthy pursuit because we actually know that it positively relates to team performance as well as team viability, how much a team sticks together. So we believe that it's a worthy pursuit to try to get these things in place. I already talked about the conditions that are needed in order for shared leadership to emerge. And yet, I also think it's important to understand that it's not a silver bullet, that the effectiveness of it depends on certain circumstances. But what we do know is that it's more beneficial when team members trust each other, that they depend on one another to get their job done. So I've heard people now talk a lot in DAOs about sometimes it just takes 3 or 4 people to move mountains. And I really think a lot of that is because you get greater task interdependence, where you have 3 or 4 people that are really collaborating more deeply on advancing a body of work. And then also as part of that, having tasks. So that's a way that we can make sure that we're incentivizing people to get involved, but it's also a way to keep them engaged and continuing to share the leadership. And then lastly, as I mentioned, we actually do know that hierarchy can be harmful to teams because it does activate more conflict. And yet, having less hierarchy, we know, does help members coordinate. So we do believe that in the decentralized world of work, there is better grounds for true shared leadership. There is better grounds for less human conflict and greater human coordination. And we know that through research, but we also know that through our experiences already participating in DAOs. It's amazing what can happen fueled by a community. And so if I were to sum up all this, I know I've been talking for a while, and I'd love to just open it up to conversation. But the last thing I'll do is give you just 2 things that I believe are super important for anyone leading in a DAO or wanting to demonstrate the utmost leadership right now for where most DAOs are at. And that is really this last message on the last slide of imagination and clarification. And I think it's so critical that we continue as leaders to be helping people. And when I say leaders, I mean every single person in a DAO. If you are part of a community, you have the ability to influence in this evolving context. And imagination is really about pulling people's eyes toward a future. It's much more difficult to ask them to just stop copying and pasting their Web 2 mindset. It is much more compelling, inspiring, and effective to start painting pictures of new realities that are engaging and that speak to the significant benefits of how DAOs operate and what they can accomplish. And then the second piece of that is clarification of constantly, almost painstakingly clarifying, what do we value in this DAO? What's important about contributing in this DAO? What is the most worthy work right now that we can see? And how do people surface more worthy work that we can't see? And constantly having your drumbeat be about having each person, given their influence within the DAO, regardless of what that influence is, to be constantly clarifying, because people are popping in and out. They're participating in maybe multiple DAOs. They're trying to keep it all straight. And honestly, I think the most effective DAOs are going to be the ones that really offer that support and helping people keep things straight and keep the hope high. And so that's what we have so far. Right now, we're doing a lot of literature reviews on different aspects of leadership from the past, but how it relates and translates to DAO context. And then the second part of our research is really doing primary research of interviewing people who work inside DAOs on leadership that have maybe worked at multiple DAOs or been in leadership positions within DAOs in order to understand exactly how this brand of leadership is different. But hopefully this grounds you in a little bit of where we've been as researchers, where our mind's been, but way more importantly, I'd love to just open it up and have you all talk with one another. I think I have maybe one question, but we can move on to that very last slide to kick things off, but I'd also be happy to hear what resonated with you, what are your initial reflections, and then of course this question here you can feel free to respond to as well.
Okay, that's pretty awesome. Thank you very much. Actually, you just answered my first question I was going to ask you. And I heard you previously before saying about imagination and clarification. So thank you for answering my question. Does anybody else have anything to say?
Wait, Neon Demon, what was your question going to be?
It was about
that. Oh.
About imagination and clarification. From her previous chat from yesterday, she, with Clayton, that was the one thing I wrote, imagination and clarification. So I was going to ask her about that, but she's just answered it.
Gotcha. That's neat.
So open up to the floor to anybody else. Maybe about whether you agree with the shared leadership model. Sorry, Raiders, I cut you off.
Yeah, no, I think Ike was cutting in a little while off. Do you want to go ahead in a little while? I'll add after you.
I was just gonna say that I thought after a full day of after hearing Lisa speak yesterday, I'd have more questions, but I seem to be like learning more, taking more in. Neon, I would say, yeah, I definitely agree with the shared leadership. I see it happening. We have all sorts of different like little groups that have been working on different aspects of putting this DAO together like the last 3 months, really. Yeah, and then it's all kind of coming together to like accomplish what we've set out to do. So it's pretty cool.
Yeah, I was just gonna second that. Basically, I like the model. I don't think I've seen it framed in such a way before, so it's really helpful to see this, to be part of this session and to see this presentation the way you have it, Lisa. So thanks for that. Yeah, and I think in a little while, kind of really set it up right in the sense that we've had these requirements, right? Sort of quote unquote requirements of setting up a couple of key pieces of the DAO so that we can function in a sort of autonomous fashion as our own group. And it's really put a lot of great people in a position to contribute in a way that we are engaging with each other in that kind of model of shared leadership. So I wouldn't say that we've got it down pat or we've got it, we've worked out the formula for it, but I think we do have a really great set of people that make it possible to have those kinds of conversations and meetings and, take the necessary actions to move things forward in a way that is beneficial to the larger rather than just the few that are having those conversations. So yeah, sometimes it takes a bit out of us, sometimes it's a bit more effort than we imagine, but overall I think the value that we've been building has been returned back to all of us that have been engaged in this process for since it started. So yeah, really great being part of the session, and thanks for that. And I think that's kind of my reflection in terms of how that, I guess, influence of the people that help orchestrate the DAO foundation for the Superhumans kind of, I guess, evolved over time.
Okay, thanks, Ray. There's a question here from Absolute Unit, but maybe you want to say something first, Lisa?
Oh no, I'm good.
Yep. Okay. So Absolute Unit says, are there any examples you found out in Web 2 that have a somewhat similar leadership structure to what you're seeing come together in Web 3?
Mm. Yeah, I'm just reading the second little piece of that. Yeah, and hearing this all together makes the full picture of leadership in DAOs come to life. Yes, there are actually. So there's a couple areas that we want to investigate further. And one of those is leadership in cooperatives. And there's also work where leadership is present in volunteer organizations. And the reason those are important is because sometimes DAOs really depend on people giving their time and energy, but they may, be present for a season and then may leave. And so there's certain structures that we're looking at that we think we could look at those structures and see how does leadership work effectively there. And those are some of the literature reviews that we have coming up. But the other space that I think is probably the most, fit for DAOs is actually not as much in the co-op and nonprofit space, especially given some of the scale of some of these organizations and how quickly I think, it wouldn't be a shocker for people in 5 years to see some DAOs that are bigger or more successful than some of the Fortune 500. And I think when it comes to that sort of breed of DAO, to me, I'm very excited about what I've seen in holacratic organizations. And holacracy is really this more, I don't know if you all are familiar, but if you're not familiar with holacracy or teal organizations, Frederick Laloux has written a book on it about reinventing organizations. And then also, I just re-listened to Brian Robertson's audiobook called Holacracy, because they just actually updated their constitution, which kind of was an all or nothing, into more of a progressive decentralization path. And it's now their Holacracy Constitution 5.0. And I think a lot of that was actually in response to what's been unfolding in DAOs over the past year. And holacratic organizations are meant to basically be distributed power, distributed leadership, or diffused leadership, shared leadership, whatever phrase you'd like to put on it. But they actually offer probably one of the best known case studies is Zappos. Zappos tried becoming a much more flat organization. And one of the things that they did was really set up this structure where you have these small pods. And if you look at Index Coop's more recent governance structure or Yearn Finances, there was also one other organization that I saw, that Orca Protocol. It basically uses this where they have their pods. And then within the pod, you usually have a facilitator and a secretary, as well as what they call a lead link. And that lead link's role is not to necessarily make any decisions on behalf of the pod members, but really to serve as a bridge to map them back to the more centralized. And when I say centralized, what I mean is almost like if you picture a cell membrane, you have this one large cell membrane that's the DAO, and then you have these smaller pods within that. And so what you're really doing is bringing it back to the larger, more zoomed out view versus it being centralized as going up. It's more about zooming out. And that, I think, has a lot of kernels of wisdom and proven out tactics that have been used in multiple organizations that are trying to aim for distributed authority and leadership and power. I think that's actually probably the closest I've seen. And we will be writing a literature review on holacratic organizations in the coming months.
Wow, that's great. I've never heard of that before. So like what In a Little While is saying, we're learning lots today. Absolute Unit has a follow-up as well. Can you also speak at all to the longevity of structures that have this fluid membership, essentially volunteer armies? Do you see any commonalities in those that last? Thinking of things like number of people who could be considered a core, how the structure is set up, etc.
Yeah. So I'll fully disclose that I have not gone in depth into the research in this space, but I have been super fascinated by it. And my sister actually works in United Way, and they leverage a lot of volunteers. But I think as one of the more successful and longstanding nonprofits here in the United States, one of the things that I've noticed is more effective than a lot of my other friends who run in primarily volunteer-based organizations is having a core that is actually set up to be incentivized, rewarded, and to remain engaged. And if you have people that are going to continually see themselves as, I dare I say, like leaders of that organization, you can have the armies of volunteers come and go and turn over, as long as you have this core unit that's really dedicated to advancing the work. The other thing I'd add on to this is I recently saw an article that showed 3 different rings, and the center ring was really about promoting your core contributors within your DAO. And then you have, the not necessarily seasonal, but the irregular contributors. And then you have the very passive contributors. And the goal was really to focus on those first 2 rings, to focus on the people who are engaged, who are consistently advancing your organization, and to ensure that they're being incentivized, rewarded. And one of the other aspects that I believe is super applicable to DAOs is this notion of appreciative inquiry, which is this idea of strengths-based processes. And the tagline that I always tell people is, if you want to accelerate your DAO, and if you are dependent upon volunteers, or you have a lot of lurkers or people that come and go, focus your energy on the people who are advancing the work regularly, and then those people that you think might enter into that ring, but ultimately are not quite sure how, of making sure you educate them, you meet with them and have a personal touch, and you give them bridges and ways to get involved more. And that the bottom line is appreciate to accelerate.
That's another one I'm going to write down.
I think similar to volunteer organizations, when people feel seen, they feel heard, even if they're not compensated. People want to know they're appreciated. A lot of the people who have left their jobs in the United States, in droves and truly record-breaking numbers, starting last August, a lot of the people have mentioned that their reason for quitting is a lack of appreciation. It's not actually pay, it's not actually compensation. It's this idea of not having autonomy and not having appreciation. And I think DAOs solve for the autonomy, but really need to up their work on appreciation, and having not just that as something they aspire to do, but actually building it into their infrastructure on how they're going to do that well.
Okay, awesome.
Amazing.
Oh, please.
No, that's all I wanted to add. I very much agree with what she said.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else have any questions?
I kind of wanted to talk about on that last note a little more. I feel like that's something that really resonates with me. Part of the reason I even got involved with SuperUMA is because I don't feel appreciated at my current corporate job. But even though I do like little things here and there for SuperUMA, I feel like those little things are appreciated and are seen, and then people, even if it's a little bit, I get positive feedback, and I think that's the biggest drive for wanting to do well and wanting to succeed and excel the group.
I can finally talk now. I totally agree. Thank you, Lisa, by the way, for answering those questions. Gave me a lot to think about for sure and look at on my own. But I think that was Waifu. That is like the core of what I want people to think about as onboarders, is like, how can we really exemplify that? How can we get that out there right off the bat? And I think that that's a big reason why too, once we get our tipping tokens back, the SuperHumans DAO has such a culture of tipping, because we just appreciate each other and want to show that we believe in others, etc. So yeah, something I think we do extremely well, and not to pat ourselves on the back, but cool to hear that, Waifu.
I think that was A.H. Wolf that was speaking.
That was me. Oh, or was A.H. Wolf about?
Yeah, I thought
before you.
Waifu might have said something else earlier, so I thought you were talking about something else. Yeah, that was
Apologies,
me.
A.H. Wolf. Dang, I
No,
got
all good.
confused by your guys' voice. Apologies, man.
All good.
So I am curious as to what within Superhumans are
Cool.
some of the areas.
We got another.
Oh, yeah.
Sorry. Yep.
Do you have another question? Have you done any research on the Green Bay Packers and how they incorporate structure in their DAO? No, I haven't.
Yeah, just quickly from Deadcoin, because of the success they have had, and it has so many moving parts.
I think you're coming out behind Neon Demon, just a heads up.
Yeah, Deadcoin, can you share a little bit more? I didn't know the Green Bay Packers had a DAO. Maybe I'm just not hip and with it, but can you share a little more?
Yeah, sorry about that. I didn't want to talk because my kid just got home from school and he's going crazy. But yeah, just so I didn't realize they were a DAO till just a couple months ago when we started to become a DAO and I started to look things up. And yeah, just how much they have a head office and they have players on the field and they have so much going on. I was just curious. I didn't know if you did any research, about the way they structured it because I haven't really gotten deep into it. That was my question because it seems like they have everything going pretty much, pretty good. And I know they have levels of, not a hierarchy, but you have a structure in there where they have the front office that tells, make some decisions. And I was just curious as if you had looked into how that worked and how it, became so successful.
Yeah, I haven't seen it. I didn't know they were a DAO. So now I have my own homework to go run and dig into. And one thing that I am not at all surprised by is this notion of having centralized offices that might be tied to a backend DAO or vice versa in a way. I think there's going to be a lot of hybrid models popping up. There will be people who see the promise of DAOs and the potential structure, but aren't maximalists or idealists in the sense of getting to full decentralization because they don't want the trade-off of maybe slower speed at times or more of the consensus decision making. And that's I know to a lot of people in DAOs, they're like, no, that's exactly why we're doing all of this is to get to that full decentralized picture. And I know that for a lot of organizations to progressively decentralize is actually a very worthy path. And hopefully what we can do is do enough research and present enough case studies that we can make that path to true decentralization more frictionless. And I think one of the things that I know we will see is that more organizations will start centralized and then move toward decentralization. Because ones that truly start fully decentralized and then try to introduce controls, all of human history has told us that humans will reject that outright. If you try to introduce more controls and less autonomy, that will get puked on compared to if you start more centralized and then like the Green Bay Packers and then try to become more decentralized, that actually is a more an easier path to take a community on, and therefore is already emerging as a bit of a blueprint or roadmap for some DAOs. So there will be a lot of people who are in this hybrid middle ground, but hopefully we can keep the blueprint going toward more ownership and transparency and the full realization of decentralization. I'm curious, I'd love to hear from other people, like what are the biggest challenges you're facing or possibilities do you see for leadership within the Superhumans?
Okay, cool. Another question I had was, oh,
I think Neon Demon, you might be coming out of sync over here.
Yeah, I'm getting the same.
Can you hear us?
oh,
This
hear me
is a
now?
little funny.
Yeah, I appreciate
Sorry.
it.
Could you repeat your question, Lisa, and then maybe Neon, you could ask after that?
Yeah. So the question I had was, what are some of the biggest challenges or possibilities do you see for leadership with the Superhumans?
Real quick, Neon, you might want to stop sharing your screen or leave and come back. Just FYI.
Yeah, let's do that.
Okay.
So like we've gone from this move kind of from our own process of centralization, like where Risk Labs and the UMA core team was really making all the decisions, especially like around our compensation. But kind of helping to guide a lot of the other directions that we were going as well. And now we're moving to like a fully decentralized community, which has taken a lot of work, as anyone could probably imagine. So during this time, we like one thing already came up was like that culture of tipping. I wouldn't say that the culture has left, right? But it kind of has been. I mean, it has been non-existent because we haven't had the ability, like the funding to do it as we work on that process of funding. And then another area that I personally like with the ambassador team have seen is that to like keep working with other protocols while we're internalizing as much as we have been has been a real challenge as well.
Makes sense. Others?
For the question, I'm sorry, I just want to clarify. The question was, it was very clear. Apparently I'm slow today. It was just what are the greatest opportunities for leadership within the Superhumans?
Yeah. Well stated.
Okay. And you probably even said that exactly. I just didn't understand at that exact moment. But I would say, I would say they're similar to other organizations at this point, other DAOs. It's that we're trying to work on a way that we can actually structure this out in a lot better format where we actually know the exact needs that we have as a DAO. But without getting too much structure, it's such a fine line, that we have to walk where we want to stay decentralized. We don't want to be too, but we also have to be an organization, right? We can't forget that we're also, it's decentralized autonomous organization, not decentralized autonomous club, right? So, we're trying to get the structure in place to do that. So I think there's so many opportunities now where if there's any needs that need to be filled, like I said, with the whole leadership thing and initiative, like you said, initiative is the number one key here. So anything that needs to be filled, somebody can step up and do. And just because now we have titles like team lead or whatever they are, I don't remember all of them right now because I'm blanking. But just because we have all those doesn't mean that people need to necessarily follow them. I remember very early on, I would see like Mid-A or Chris or whoever just like taking ownership and doing things, even if it wasn't necessarily nobody told them to do that. So I don't know if that even answers your question. That's why I was trying to take it in a different direction.
Yeah, I think that's beautiful. I think, semantics are so important. When we say things like leader, it presumes there are followers. And so, in Holacracy, they have things like lead links, but really that person's role is to just be a link more than it is to do things, but they also are responsible for assigning work. And sometimes people go, well, assigning, that sounds authoritative. But then you assign work because you need somebody to move work forward and make decisions. But ultimately, then people can choose to almost like this option tree of accept, reject, or counteroffer. And I think what we're really trying to do is to give people choice without having that lead to swirl. And like you said, I think it's a fine balance. Well, this has been really lovely. I don't know, Neon Damon, it looks like you've joined back. Do you have any parting words?
Well, just maybe if anybody who hasn't spoken yet want to just ask a final question, maybe. I'm not sure whether he's trying to speak or not. Possibly not. I did have a question. We, as a DAO, we are people from everywhere. There's North America, African, Europe, Asia. Does that factor in your studies at all, in your research? Or are you just doing North American or worldwide?
Well, right now, the two people that I partner with in the decentralized leadership space, one is the data scientist, Mr. Nobody, who is from Italy. And then the other person actually works, in a Web 2 IT software company leading a very large group of like 450 people. So we've got, and he's based out of Germany. So we've got a good mix of people who are deep data science, but also who have practitioner experience. And then a lot of the work that I've done through my PhD research has been on international human resource development. So obviously there are different cultural values by country, even subcultures within those countries. So there's a lot of differences, and yet there are certain aspects that are appreciated. For example, like the concept of appreciation. How people like to be appreciated is why the also leadership skill set of coaching becomes so important, because you need to be curious about individuals and treat them as individuals. So I think that's the part that we know is common across leadership practices. So when you ask questions of individuals and can treat them as individuals, that becomes a much more effective approach than telling, selling, or yelling, which can often be a progression in traditional organizations, your point of view. And so I think turning up curiosity and appreciation is one thing I know I can advocate for across all cultures when it comes to being influential in an evolving culture.
That's awesome. Thank you. Does anyone have any last parting words? Just to say thank you to Lisa as well.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Lisa.
Lisa.
Thank you, Lisa.
Stay super.
Thanks, Lisa. Bye.
Wonderful. Thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your day or evening. Bye-bye.
Thanks for the
Stay
awesome
super.
presentation.
Thank you.
Bye. Thanks, Lisa.
Thank you, everyone.